With the season continually dwindling down, we have four more possible candidates that could end up being in the running for the University of Louisville men's basketball head coaching position. Let's get right on into the show.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome in to another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I serve as a credentialed media member for Cardinal Sports Zone, and I also do some PA announcing work for the university in various sports. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has have you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Also want to take this time to say thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about four possible options for the men's basketball head coaching position. That is Providence's Ed Cooley, Seton Hall's Kevin Willard, UCONN's Dan Hurley, and Cincinnati's Wes Miller. We'll also do the mailbag at the end. But we'll start out with the Big East coaches. That is Providence's Ed Cooley and Seton Hall head coach Kevin Willard, who many Louisville fans already are familiar with, having served as an assistant under Rick Pitino earlier in his tenure as the Louisville men's basketball head coach. We'll start out with Cooley, 52 years old. Now, I feel like I have to say this every episode. Just because I talk about them on the podcast doesn't necessarily mean that they're, quote unquote, a serious candidate in the search. As of right now, if you've been following the search, there hasn't been much news at all. In fact, it's kind of been the opposite. The university's kind of kept everything, close to vest or close to chest, I should say. But you see where I'm getting at. There's just not been a lot of news. So, on these episodes, I want to, break down the possible candidates, ones that have been mentioned on the initial lists. All four of these guys have been mentioned on the initial lists. I did rile up the Purdue fan base by talking about Matt Painter, despite, coming out and saying, look, he's probably not going to be a serious candidate for the job, nor would I truly believe he would leave Purdue. And the comments in the YouTube section were incredible. But you see where I'm coming from. Like, I'm not saying that, okay, these four guys are seriously being considered for the job. I'm just, analyzing their candidacies and how, good of a fit they would be here and whether or not it would even be a feasible option. So without further ado, let's get right on into the first guy. That is Providence head coach Ed Cooley. Like I said, making 52. He is 52 years old. He's making just over $2 million a year at Providence. I did some digging to try to find any type of a buyout figure. I believe he has one, but I'm not necessarily sure what that figure is. But I do know that back in 2019, seemingly the consensus that he turned down the Michigan job in 2019, or at least that's the grasp that I had on this situation from what I've been reading on. But ultimately, this is one of those things where I feel like, would he be a decent fit at Louisville? Yeah, I mean, I think he's a guy that, wins games even when he doesn't necessarily have the talent. I mean, since, he started out his career 5 years at Fairfield, didn't make the tournament in either of those, came to Providence 2011. He's been there ever since. He's made the NCAA tournament 5 years in a row from 2013-14 down to 2017-18. Didn't make it in the next season, 2020. Obviously, it would have been interesting. They were 19-12 that year, 13-13 last year. Didn't make the tournament. They're 19-2 right now. They're 15th in the country. They just beat a Georgetown team. They're a team that doesn't necessarily get a ton of style points. Like, he's not going to be a coach that is going to wow you, with extravagant offenses or anything like that. In fact, it's the other way around. I think, kind of like a Pitino-esque type coach in the sense that it's a smothering defensive mentality, and good defense leads to good offense, so to speak. So ultimately, I think that would he be a good coach for the University of Louisville? I mean, yeah. I mean, he would be a guy that I think, runs his program really well. He gets guys to buy into the team first mentality. He gets players who aren't necessarily maybe as talented to play to a high level. Hasn't necessarily done much when it comes to tournament time, but you could argue that with a with more resources here at Louisville, that he would ultimately be in a better position to succeed. Would he consider the position? I think he would likely interview for it. Now, whether or not he would leave Providence, I mean, if the rumors are true, if he did turn down the Michigan offer, then it makes you wonder, okay, would he do the same for this Louisville offer? I think that Louisville is a better job than Michigan when it's all said and done. But ultimately, you have to, make the question of that. I think that, if you double his pay or even, increase it by $1 million, give him more resources for recruiting. That's another aspect of it. It's not determined whether or not he would take the job or not. You would assume he would, with Louisville being a better job than Providence, but you truly never know, especially if he did turn down the Michigan job. In the recruiting aspect, not a ton to really base it off of. Providence has been a college that really has recruited their type of athletes, 3-star guys, low 4 stars that, are being tasked with being developed, and Ed Cooley has done a very good job of doing that. As we remember, some of those Providence teams in Big East play were some pesky teams to deal with. There was a 30-point loss one year. Just an overall a tough team to play regardless of where you played them at. Ed Cooley, a very good coach, 52 years old. He's very experienced, could offer a stable hand to rebuild the program or retool the program, I should say. Recruiting is an aspect of it that it makes you wonder, okay, well, what would happen if if he got hired? How would he improve recruiting-wise? That's definitely something that you have to take into consideration. From a Louisville aspect of it, I think that it would be a risk because, yes, he does more with less, so to speak, doesn't have a ton of experience in the tournament, doesn't have a lot of tournament success. Very improving on the recruiting trail as well, recruiting against Power 5 schools for the top guys. It's just one of those things. It would be an uninspiring hire, I would say, for the Louisville fan base. Although he's a guy who's won over 20 games multiple times as the head coach of the Friars, and he's going to win 20 games likely this year, being 19-2. He wouldn't be the worst hire. I think he would actually be a pretty solid hire. But at the end of the day, I'm not so sure how much this unifies the fan base. I'm not sure if this checks off enough boxes in terms of recruiting or NCAA tournament experience or stuff like that. You can make the case, well, Kenny Payne has never been a head coach before. How would he be a better option than Ed Cooley? Who knows if he is or not, deep down, but he does check off the recruiting box, the unifying the fan base, et cetera, getting, some former player backing. But Ed Cooley be a good coach. I'm just not necessarily sure that he is a good fit here. That applies to the other Big East coach in Seton Hall's Kevin Willard. Obviously, I think if there's any of these possible options that understand the gravity and the nature of this position, it's Kevin Willard, a guy that has coached under Rick Pitino. Was the head coach at Iona for 3 years. Didn't make the tournament either of the years ever since he has been at Seton Hall, where he has won over 20 games multiple times from 2015 to 2019, made the NCAA tournament 4 straight times. They were the Big East regular season champion in 2020 before COVID hit. 14-13, didn't make the tournament last year, but they are 14-7 now and ranked in the top 25. So he's a guy that you would assume would be a guy that's going to be coaching a tournament game this year. He's 46 years old. To be such a young guy, he has over 10 years of head coaching experience, which is valuable. He understands the Louisville job. Whether or not he would be, whether or not he would do the right things on the recruiting trail, kind of like Ed Cooley, it's yet to be seen. There's a lot of uncertainty there, but he is very solid in terms of getting his guys prepared, very defensive-minded as well, but also as a guy that, from what I've seen, plays through his star players. Saw what Miles Powell did for the Pirates, seemingly for 12 years. Angel Delgado as well, playing through his star players. I guess, for lack of better terms, he is able to, retool his coaching philosophy based upon his, any given squad, stuff like that. So far, I think he's getting paid just less than Ed Cooley. I think it's like $100,000 difference where he's making like $2.1 million. I'm not sure the buyout figure either, but he's a guy that has been thrown out there as possible candidate for the Maryland job, stuff like that. You would have to assume that if he gets the call, he would interview and likely take the job, given his affiliation with the university. Over his coaching career, but I think it's kind of like they're in the same boat. Ed Cooley and Kevin Willard both are uninspiring hires for the fan base. There's a lot of risk in terms of recruiting, not a ton of NCAA tournament resume experience in terms of wins and getting far in the tournament, and also it's just one of those things that it's probably an uninspiring hire. Just not one of the flashy hires. Although I do think both guys would be pretty solid coaches here. Probably more Evan Cooley than Willard. Evan Conley. I'm losing my mind. I apologize. It is from football recruiting to basketball coaching news. There's no shortage of any type of content or stuff like that. But good coaches, just not necessarily sure that it's the right fit for either Ed Cooley or Kevin Willard. I want to take this time now to transition into some AAC options and UConn's Dan Hurley and Cincinnati's Wes Miller. We'll get into those here in just a second as we talk about our friends and the title sponsor of the show, BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before as football continues its march through the playoffs right toward the big game here in just under a week. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just football. BetOnline has up to the minute info on pro and college hoops, NHL, boxing, UFC, along with live real-time updates on current games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2022 season. BetOnline is where the game starts. It's Super Week, brought to you by Get Upside, and there's no better place to get coverage of the big game than the Locked On NFL podcast. Locked On Bengals and Locked On Rams are both in LA all week covering the big game. Transitioning, I want to go into the American Athletic Conference, where UConn's Dan Hurley and Cincinnati's Wes Miller have been rumored to possibly be in contention for the job. They were on initial lists like Cooley and Willard and most of the candidates that have been talked about since Kenny Payne and probably Bruce Pearl. It's really not known how serious of candidates either of them are. So that's something that you have to take into consideration as it might just be a moot point. These guys might not necessarily be in the running, so this might just be for nothing. But ultimately, we'll continue into the AAC. We'll begin with Dan Hurley. Dan Hurley is probably the most exciting possible option on this list of four candidates. Currently the coach of UConn, made the tournament last year. James Bouknight was an NBA lottery pick. I was excited to see what he did there. I loved his teams at Rhode Island. 49-year-old head coach has spent pretty much a decade as a head coach, which is big. His last 2 years at Rhode Island, they were a giant killer, won over 20 games, 3 times there in the Rams program, NCAA tournament twice in the past 2 seasons. In UConn, missed the tournament the first 2 years. It was pretty much a full rebuild, and then they made the tournament this past year at 15-8, and then now currently they're 15-6 and a ranked team. So, it's one thing to where he's shown that he can recruit. He has a top 30 prospect committed for the 2023 class, and he's shown that with the resources that he has the opportunity to recruit and can recruit at a high level. So one of those things to where, coaching-wise, he's not necessarily afraid to go, a small ball lineup, isn't necessarily, too reliant on the 3-point shot, but does like to emphasize high octane shooting from the outside in terms of just getting good looks. And I think being able to run different styles out there, whether it be small ball, the traditional 5, he really does well in terms of his overall coaching philosophy as it relates to a certain year squad. I thought he played really well through James Bouknight last year. Put the ball in his hands and realized, hey, look, the ball needs to be in our best players' hands the majority of the time, and it showed in the NCAA through the NCAA tournament, I should say. He makes more than any of these 4 coaches. He's sitting at I think it's just at around $3 million. It might be just a little under that. I'm not sure his buyout either. It's so hard to find these coaches' buyouts. I feel like Nate Oates is just right there. It's like, hey, $12 million. but you can't really find anybody else's except for Wes Miller's. We'll talk about that here in just a second, but I think he's a guy that he doesn't necessarily have any ties at Louisville or anything like that, being a guy that's native of, up east in the I think he's from New Jersey, actually. But he's been a guy that has turned around each program that he has been at, went from 8-21 his first year at Rhode Island to 26-8 by the time he left 6 years later, and he's doing the same thing at UConn. Both of them are in the top 25 these past 2 years. So I think he's one of those guys to where he might not necessarily be an inspiring hire at the beginning, but I do think he would be one of the better coaching options on this list of the long list of guys that have been rumored for a possible linking for the position. He checks the boxes of recruiting. I just think he's one of the best coaches on here, one of the best X's and O's guys. These guys that want to play for him. He is a player's coach. I've talked to some people that absolutely love him. Think he's a very, very nice guy and stuff like that. But overall, it's just a matter of how many wins and losses you get. His track record shows that he's kind of like a Steve Forbes option in my mind. He's one of those guys that wouldn't necessarily, the public perception wouldn't be great to start out with, but he'd be one of the better X and O's guys on the list. So transitioning over into Wes Miller, the head coach of the Cincinnati Bearcats, in his first season in Cincinnati. They are 15-6. He spent nearly a decade as the head coach of the UNC Greensboro Spartans. And fun fact, my first ever Division I college basketball announcing, my first time announcing a Division I men's college basketball game was the UNC Greensboro Spartans taking on the Duquesne Dukes last year in the Allen Houston Tip-Off Classic. One of the two, Wade Houston. You see what I mean. But I got to see up close and personal how Miller runs his systems. Not necessarily great offensively. They are extremely attentive on the defensive side of things. Isaiah Miller was the big-time standout for the Spartans last season. They made the NCAA tournament last year. They made the tournament only twice in in his tenure in the Southern Conference. But it's one of those things to where if you don't win your conference tournament, you're not going to make the NCAA tournament. And it's one of those things to where he's 39 years old. He's making around I think it's $1.25 million, and it goes up $25,000 every year up until the 2026-27 conclusion. Buyout is $3 million until this season ends, which it drops. I'm not sure exactly the figure in which it drops to. He's one of those guys. It's another. I think he's probably the biggest risk because he doesn't necessarily have a lot of tournament experience. Who knows how good of a recruiter he is. And who knows exactly how much sustained success he can have at a major conference. But he is a solid X's and O's coach. He's one of the risers in the college coaching realm. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things where nothing is a given. You just have to kind of bank on certain things. I'm not necessarily sure that he would be a inspiring hire. All four of these coaches would not necessarily be inspiring hires. So I do think that all four of these guys could have success here at Louisville. I don't necessarily think that either are serious candidates at the moment, but honestly, I couldn't tell you. I'm not really sure exactly who the front runners are. If a decision has been made, if it has been made, who is it? Is there a short list? Those are questions that we hope to have answered this week. So all eyes will stay glued on to the Louisville basketball program. Solid options. I think that Cooley and Hurley are probably the two best options of the four, and Willard and Miller would kind of be safety nets. But I do think that all four are very solid coaches. So we'll see how things go. All four would likely entertain the Louisville position. It's a better job than any of the four are at currently. And I think if all four were offered the job, all four would accept. But the kicker, so to speak, is how big of an option are they? How serious of a candidate are they in the search? Who knows at this point? We'll take the time now to transition over to the mailbag. We have a couple good questions here before the end of this Monday edition of the show. We'll talk about what those questions are here after we talk about Built Bar. Look, it's the new year. It's the time of year that, I've pretty much given up on all my New Year's resolutions, but not this year. I'm sticking to my resolution to eat right thanks to Built Bar. It almost feels like it's not really a resolution because I actually enjoy eating them. Have you ever tried the Puffs? It's new. If you haven't, you're missing out on one of the Built Bar's best tasting bars. Puffs are the first ever protein-infused marshmallow. They're fluffy. They're marshmallowy, obviously. They're not just a protein bar. They're a treat, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. They're a fan favorite with some incredible flavors: cinnamony churros, coconut marshmallow, banana cream pie, etc. They're going to be your new favorite. All Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, 100% real chocolate, low calorie, high protein. Replace your candy bars with these. Go to Built.com and scroll down to the macros chart, and you'll be blown away with the high protein numbers, low calories, high fiber, low carbs. Compare that to a candy bar, and it blows it out of the water. So do yourself a favor. Go to Built.com. Use the promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your order. Once again, that's use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. All right, final segment of the show, dedicated to the mailbag segment. We didn't do one last week. There was a ton of news with recruiting and with, possible front runners for the coaching job and stuff like that. So there's a couple that I want to focus on here. Number one is it was actually submitted right before the recording of this show, and it sees. I saw your tweet about there possibly being big recruiting weekends for the month of March and the month of April. Can you expand a little bit on that? I think, well, first of all, it's a good question. Thank you for submitting it. I think it's pretty straightforward. I think, it's pretty clear cut. We're going to have some more visitors. The visitor list is already piling up for March. Four-star quarterback commit Pierce Clarkson is going to be back in town for March, working to confirm if he's going to be here for the spring game. Haven't gotten any confirmation on that, but I know that some commits will be there in attendance for the spring game, and some highly rated guys will be there. So we'll kind of see back and forth. It's one of those things to where we'll get a final list as we get closer. I think we're entering a dead period to where not a lot of contact between the two, but I can tell you that there are multiple commits on the horizon. Two in particular that I had been made aware of, and even Scott Satterfield said in his press conference last Wednesday after the conclusion of National Signing Day recap is that at the end of the day, they do have a commit in the works for 2023, but it hasn't been announced to the public, and he said it would be soon. So, if my sources are correct, it looks like we've got multiple on the way. Now, when they decide to make their decisions, that I am not sure, but it is still good news coming for Card Nation. The next question is in relation to Scott Satterfield's press conference. He says the question is, Scott Satterfield alluded to the possibility of adding more players in the 2022 class. Do you think that those are going to be high school players, and if so, what positions? I think it's always key to have a couple scholarships that you have available after spring ball, because players are, not necessarily liking where they are on the depth chart. You could have players, transfer out of a certain position, etc. I think that the possible additions would more likely be transfers. I don't necessarily think there are that many high school prospects left on the recruiting trail that haven't signed somewhere or even at least committed somewhere. So I think that as of right now, I think that the program is done for high school commits. They're probably just kind of in wait and see mode after spring ball to see what kind of transpires, see where they need to add depth and stuff like that. My answer would be the defensive backs room, but they added 3 to 4 guys in that room in the past handful of weeks. So shout out to the coaching staff on that. In my opinion, you could look for more help on the defensive line, especially in the interior. I think I read somewhere where the defense is going to be, transitioning more into a 4-3 base rather than a 3-4. So you're adding more possibilities on the defensive line. That could be another thing to where they look to get some defensive tackles into the room, with those positions. With Mohamed Sanogo, I'm not necessarily sure in the Yasir Abdul announced that he's coming back. They may look to maybe add another linebacker just to ensure the depth there. You could always add to possible wide receiver numbers. It just kind of depends, offensive line, etc. But I think the defensive line is the place where I've kind of looked at thinking, this is probably where the team needs the most depth. So, final question as it relates to football. With the release of the 2022 schedule, initial thoughts on the record for next year. You don't have to go into in-depth analysis. Yeah, we'll definitely be going over that after basketball ends and as we kind of get closer to the off season and stuff like that as spring ball comes about. Ultimately, I think that the goal should definitely be 8 wins. I think that the beginning of the season offers the opportunities to get those wins. The last 3 games of the season are tough. I think it's Clemson, NC State, and Kentucky. So those are very tough games. You also have Pittsburgh on the schedule. So, the schedule is kind of like last year to where you have your opportunities to win games. You just have to go out there and execute. So I think, 7-5 and 8-4 is kind of where I have the team going for next year. Basketball-wise, do you still think a decision comes after the season? And if so, would it be more so? Hold on. It's kind of weird. Okay, I got it. Do you think that a hire would be or is still going to be made after the season? And if Kenny Payne is the guy, do they still follow that timeline? Simply put, I don't know. I think that there's so much misinformation out there right now. There's just a lack of information, really. There's information on, there's going to be a hire made after the season, or, they're interviewing guys behind the scenes, or, hey, a coaching hire is coming soon. I think a coaching hire could come anywhere between sometime today and sometime in the second week of April. It really just kind of depends on the route that they go. I think that if Kenny Payne, you have kind of more of an incentive to make the hire, as soon as possible, just because, he's an assistant coach in the NBA at the moment, so there's no obligations for, a head coaching job that he is currently at because he's not at one at the moment. And then you obviously bolster possible recruiting, possible getting transfers in, and, just getting some much needed morale boost around the program. So I think that, probably – it really just kind of depends. If it's another head coach in college, we're probably looking at the very end of their season. But if it's Kenny Payne, who knows? I know that Jeremy Wallman in the latest Cardinal Sports Hub podcast alluded to the fact that it could be anytime this week, or it could be any time in the next couple weeks. So just kind of be on standby. Any information that we hear, we'll obviously report it and stuff like that. But talked about the 4 more options, the AAC coaches, the group of 5 coaches. That is Providence's Ed Cooley, Seton Hall's Kevin Willard, UConn's Dan Hurley, and Cincinnati's Wes Miller. We also conducted the weekly Monday mailbag. Tomorrow we'll get more so into talking a little bit more about some of the results from the weekend, talking about a little women's basketball, etc. Before we get out of here, a couple quick shots. First, that Cardinal Sports Zone podcast, the most recent episode dropped yesterday. You can get that at cardinalsportszone.com. Also, the Locked On Bets podcast, hosted by your boy Q, with handicapping expert analysis from Lee Sterling. You can get that on the Odyssey app or wherever you like to get your podcasts. But that's going to wrap up this Monday edition of the show. Everyone, have a great day. Have a great start to your week. Be safe, stay warm, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.